Good. Well, it's my pleasure to welcome Philip McCann to the BLSI, if virtually, not in person. And I'm sure Philip will say a few things about that in a second. But Philip is the Professor of Urban and Regional Economics at the University of Sheffield. He's actually the Chair of Urban and Regional Economics. He's a world-renowned economist on regional economics. Apart from the University of Sheffield, he's also at various other universities in Europe, like the University of Groningen, for example. And he's also advisor to the OECD and to the European Commission on, leveling the playing field and leveling up, which I think is critically important in the UK. Philip and I had a quick discussion before we all started here. We are of a similar vintage. And Philip went to Cambridge, I went to Leeds, the northern city of Leeds in 1984. And the early years of Thatcherism were already being felt, and talk of deindustrialization, the north and south divide were already on everybody's lips. So I think, here we are some 40 years later, more or less, and clearly we're still talking about leveling up. So leveling up is still in the making. It's a bit like Hegel's dialectic. It's a constant historical change. So hopefully, Philip will tell us something much more positive than I've just posited in terms of leveling up. So it's with my great pleasure to welcome Philip McCann.
Well, thank you, Andreas. It's very, very kind words. And firstly, as I say, I should apologize to all the people here that I was not able to come. I was absolutely planning to come in person, but it was just last minute childcare issues. I just wasn't able to sort things out in a way that worked out with my wife and son, and so it's just complicated in terms of timing, because I'm also away tomorrow, so it was just complicated. So what I'm going to talk about, obviously today everybody in the UK talks about levelling up. The levelling up type of issue is something I've worked on for over 30 years. So I started working on these problems in the late 1980s when I was doing a PhD. And I myself was from the kind of northern industrial background that Andreas went to study in. That's where I'm from myself. I was originally from the Liverpool area. So the kind of experience of the 70s and 80s was something that was very relevant at the time and also subsequently in terms of intergenerational effects. And these were things that also affected my own family. So I started thinking about these things in real detail back in the late 80s and early 90s. And I've spent more than half of my career actually outside of the UK. So I've worked in the United States, I've worked in New Zealand. The last 8 years I was in the Netherlands, I've worked in Japan, Thailand. And the work I've done on these types of issues is all different forms: analytical, mathematical, empirical, qualitative, case study, policy related, whatever, across around 50 different countries. So that's the kind of background that I've worked on. But I've looked at the UK case, spent a lot of my life looking at the UK case kind of as an outsider, because, as I say, more than half of my career was working outside of the UK. So I would look at an issue, I don't know, in Japan, I'd say, so in Japan, they do this in this particular way. Why do we do it in this way in the UK? Or why in the UK do we frame the problem in this particular way, but in Australia, they ask the starting question in a very fundamentally different way? So I've been thinking about these kind of issues for many, many years. And one of the things I came to the conclusion follows the lines of argument of somebody called Angus Maddison. Angus Maddison ended up at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, where I was, although he predated my time there. He was the person who led the first international data building exercise of comparable cross-country data regarding issues around productivity, wealth, growth, economic growth, etc. And in the 1980s, Angus Maddison said that at the time in the 1980s, there were 4 kinds of countries in the world. There were developed countries, developing countries, Japan, and Argentina. And his point was Japan at the time in the 1980s just seemed to be so fundamentally different on almost every characteristic in terms of how economies work to almost any other country. You couldn't look at France or the US and use those observations to say a great deal about Japan. And equally, and that was in a positive sense, of course, Japan was growing very quickly, with a huge trade surplus, as you'll remember, whereas Argentina was the opposite story. In the 1930s, Argentina was richer than almost every European economy. But by in the 1930s, 50 years later, by the 1980s, this has effectively become a developing economy. And again, there's really no parallels to what was happening. Strangely, over time, I started to think that the UK is actually an outlier. And that's very strange because in the UK, we tend to think of ourselves as effectively setting norms on many levels: political norms, governance norms, institutional norms, behavioral norms, policy norms, international relations norms. We typically refer to ourselves as a benchmark for almost every issue. And you see this in the press, it's just every day. But actually, when you look at the economy of the UK, my argument, my thinking was over time, the UK had become so different to almost any comparator country. It was very, very difficult to say a lot about the UK unless you really start to understand what is specific about the UK and what's different, because you can't generalize from other countries to the UK or vice versa. You've got to go into much more detail. The UK is a real outlier. And I wrote a book that was published in 2016. It's called the UK Regional National Economic Problem. And I synthesized the problem down to 570 pages with about 2,000 citations, because it's actually an extraordinarily complex issue. And it's a book which has subsequently been read by 4 prime ministers and ex-prime ministers, most permanent secretaries in Whitehall, chief economists of the Bank of England, quite a lot of the present members of the present cabinet and shadow cabinet and so on. And so this is really the kind of arguments I'm going to try and communicate now, what I see the issues are. So I'm going to share my screen to start off with. And then I'm going to take you through a set of slides that I'm happy to send around afterwards if people are interested in following up on any of these issues. So what we call today leveling up, what, why, and how, what on earth are we talking about? That's really the issue. Starting point is, back in 2012, there was a couple of articles published by a little known kind of think tank person in The Spectator. And his name was Neil O'Brien. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't a member of parliament. Today, he's the Under Secretary of State who led the Levelling Up white paper writing. And he'd argued that by around 2012, 2013, the evidence suggested the UK was partitioning into really fundamentally different countries. And this is a little cartoon that was on the front of The Spectator at the time, specifically relating to these important articles. The best description of the problem that I could find in the popular press was in The Economist, and it was in 2013, November, and it was entitled A Sticky Pitch for the Tories. And The Economist argued that the way to think about what the UK economy looks like and how it functions is to use the analogy of the 2 codes of rugby. So if you are an outsider from another country where rugby is not part of the culture, then the notion of rugby union and rugby league being different games is kind of bizarre. I mean, my wife is Spanish. You know, she'll just frown if you try to explain it. It's kind of, what on earth are you talking about? Of course, it's the same game. You're running around with an egg-shaped ball. You bang into each other. You pass it backwards. You try to dive over a line, drop it on the floor, and then jump up and cheer. You have a scrum. You pass the ball backwards. You tackle by clashing into each other. And then if you get some other points, you kick in through a kind of H-shaped set of kind of goalpost, but without a goal. That's the game. Of course, they're the same game. Whereas if you are in the world of rugby, you know that they are fundamentally different games. The number of players is different. All the rules are different. The refereeing processes are different. The sequences on the game are different. The training that the players do are different. You can see they even look different, the 2 types of players. So everything on the pitch is different, and everything outside of the pitch, all the social and cultural and commercial interests tied up with those two codes, they're basically unrelated to each other. And also, the vast majority are geographically unrelated to each other. Now, of course, there are historical reasons for this, but the point is that they're played in different places to different communities of people by different communities of people. Ostensibly and out to an outsider, they look the same, but those on the inside understand that they are fundamentally different. And I think those descriptions, the idea of the kind of the country fragmenting, as you see in this image, all the two different codes of rugby is really a very good way to try and understand what's happened to the UK economy. Now, as I say, I wrote a book in 2016. I've written huge numbers of papers on these types of issues, both vis-a-vis the UK and other countries. But in particular case of the UK, obviously, I approach these things from a very technical type of approach. But the argument is basically this, and the word I use is decoupling, that the UK economy over the last 30, 40 years has internally decoupled into 2 and possibly 3 different countries. And this is on many, many indicators relating to mobility, human capital, trade, the list goes on and on. Today, we've got levelling up and rebalancing. These are the kind of discussions. And what's happened is recently the narratives have shifted dramatically, as we know, that suddenly this is a thing that many people are talking about. Not everybody, but it's certainly a central issue in terms of government policy. Indeed, last night, Panorama had a special programme on the issue. What's happened in the UK is that the UK has experienced a very particular and pretty adverse set of interactions between the geography of the country, the effects of globalization on the different parts of the country, and the nature of the governance system that we operate in the UK. And this also shapes perceptions also about how these things interact. And a lot of these perceptions are often misplaced. And that's really important if you think about the behavior of the media and politicians. So the first thing is geography. The UK is very unusual in that almost all our trade and mobility systems go directly through the heart of the most prosperous part of the country. So you think about the geography of our motorway system, our railway system, our airline systems, even our shipping systems, everything goes through the core of the Southeast. That overwhelmingly dominates, whereas that's simply not true in other countries. If you take the geography of Germany or the geography of France, their trade routes are very distributed. Why is that important? It's because it has an inflationary bottleneck effect. So that's the first point. The second point is globalization. Basically, the deindustrialization shocks of the 1980s and the rapid rise of the service economy in the UK, those shocks were very different in different parts of the country, as people will know. So huge adverse shocks in the Midlands, the north of England, South Wales, parts of Western Scotland, but relatively very positive shocks of many parts of the south of England, some parts of the East Midlands and so on, and then also individual pockets, but that's broadly what happened. The third part of the story is that the UK also became more and more centralised as a governance system over that period. And there's a huge amount of data on this. It's not just my opinion. There's enormous amounts of data on this. And we are pretty much the most centralised top-down governance system in the industrialised world, certainly for any large country. We have a governance system which is about the same as somewhere like Slovakia, a small Central or Eastern European country. That's the shape of our governance system in terms of the lack of autonomy and the lack of discretion and power of sub-central government systems. We don't really look like anybody, and we certainly don't look like any other large country. My argument is that kind of system is uniquely badly designed and ill-equipped to respond to the kind of internal inequalities which have arisen in the UK. And the reason is this. If you have a policy, it could be on anything, it could be on education, skills, environment, whatever, take your pick. If you design a policy well, you really put a lot of thought into it. You're not just trying to pick up a few kind of political points. So you're really trying to articulate a carefully worked out policy and the likely implications, medium and long term, of those interventions. If that policy is well designed and it's well delivered, then it's likely to work and to work well in all parts of the country, as long as all parts of the country are very similar to each other. So if you take a very small country in terms of area, small to medium population, such as the Netherlands, where I used to live, all parts of the country in terms of different regions, on almost every economic indicator, they're basically the same. If you take a small country population, but a larger area, such as a Finland or a New Zealand, that is also true. Social and economic indicators vary almost hardly at all, basically, across the country. Or even very, very large countries like Japan, which is twice the size of the UK, both in terms of population and in terms of area. If you're in the far north, Hokkaido, or you're in the south, in the island of Kyushu, it doesn't really matter. You know, you've got different city sizes, including the largest cities in the world, obviously being Tokyo. But the point is that apart from the numbers of people, the scale effect, all other economic dimensions, whether it's education levels, social mobility, housing quality, all of these things, basically everything's the same in every place. And therefore, if you have a well-designed policy, it will have the same implications in all parts of the country. And therefore, you have a pretty good idea about the national effect. And so both the national effect and the distributional, geographical effects work as you would hope. The problem in the UK is that's simply not true, because the internal inequalities in the UK are pretty much the largest in the industrialized world. And don't forget, the UK as a whole is only the size of the US state of Wyoming. England itself is smaller than Iowa. And we have pretty much the largest inequalities in terms of economics and consequently socio-economic outcomes. So I've just listed a couple of references you may be relevant. But how do I think about it? Well, I'm an economist, so you may say, well, he would say that anyway. But actually, if you look at the data and the evidence, for me, this is not really a discussion point. Famous economist Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize winner in 2008, he said basically in the long run, productivity isn't anything, it's just in the long run, it's almost everything. A country's ability to improve its standard of living over time depends almost entirely on its ability to raise its output per worker. That is also true in the case of regions and cities. And what we see in the UK is we have enormous interregional productivity inequalities. They're very, very high by international standards. To give you a sense of how big they are, the productivity inequalities in the UK are as big as the variations across the whole of the Eurozone. And that's in one country. So what does that mean? You have very high interregional inequalities, means that you have very high differences in all of the other socio-economic characteristics of our population, which are related to economics. So that would be wages, prosperity in general, ability to access credit, social mobility, educational attainment, innovation levels, entrepreneurship. They all start to fall in place. And the biggest one is inequalities in life expectancy. There's no country I'm aware of with such variations over such large distances in the industrialized world. So that's the problem. And as an economist, my argument is very much that this is about productivity. If you can't do something to uplift and to galvanize the productivity of the weaker parts of the country, then none of the other things we want to improve are going to improve, because basically the market is not there. The economic underpinnings of everything else. So if you think about healthcare, for example, healthcare is extremely expensive. You need a strong economy to fund healthcare, and that would apply to pretty much everything else. The difficulty in the UK is also the specifics of the UK also mean that it's hard to compare the UK with other countries on many levels. And this is a problem of narratives. So one of the things we've got at the moment is that leveling up, the kind of agenda of trying to help weaker places become more prosperous. We've got a kind of a cities versus everyone else. This is a strong narrative. It's kind of metropolitan elites versus small town Britain. It's big cities versus everyone else. It's urban versus rural. In the case of the UK, that is also simply not true. If you look at both the ONS data, the Office for National Statistics, or you look at the OECD data, which incorporates all the industrialized countries, the gaps between metropolitan urban areas and everywhere else in the UK are pretty much the smallest in the whole of the industrialized world. What we have in the UK is a very strong, what we call a core periphery partitioning. So if you take approximately London, and then you draw a line up to somewhere around Norwich, you come down across to somewhere just north of Bristol, maybe Gloucester, and you go down towards Exeter. So Bath would just be kind of sneaking in that area. And then you go right the way back across to Dover and back up. Approximately the way that part of the country works is fundamentally different in terms of productivity and prosperity to everywhere else. The exceptions would be the eastern part of Scotland, parts of the south, but the southeast, but particularly the east part of Scotland, in and around the kind of corridor, Edinburgh and Aberdeen. And then plus a few individual places. But that broadly is the core periphery partitioning in the UK. And that partitioning is getting bigger on almost every socioeconomic indicator. Now, one of the key things that seems to be separating is the question of what we call tradables versus non-tradables. The more prosperous parts of the country are improving their ability relative to the weaker parts of the country, especially in terms of their ability to produce goods and services which are exported. And that is absolutely critical for economic growth. Whereas the places which are weaker are becoming more and more trapped into the production of goods and services, which are what we call non-tradables, basically local goods and services. Now, there is, a lot of people like local this, local that, but in economics terms, local is a very dangerous trap to fall into. Because you end up towards a situation effectively of what we call autarky, where you're blocked out of other markets. And this is happening more and more. So you see these towns, you go to somewhere like part of Rochdale, for example, there's nothing in the city centre apart from payday loan shops, a few shops, places like Primark and Matalan, and the rest are pubs, betting shops, and there's really almost nothing else there. Many towns are falling into this trap. This partitioning is a really, really important problem in terms of where we're going. But also the debates in the UK are also hampered because until very recently, the idea that we do have a regional problem has been largely ignored. And there's been a lot of people in the national media saying, oh, this can't be true. In fact, I've actually got a paper on this where I quote some things by, what's the name of the Andrew Neil, the journalist, and I can't think, the guy who does Radio 5 chat show mid-morning. Anyway, I can't think of his name. Where people basically say, well, the UK just looks like every other country. That's simply not true. But until very recently, that was the consensus amongst, if you like, the national media, in terms of many thought leaders, influencers, think tanks, academic institutions, regarding these regional specific place-based types of issues. And that narrative has held sway for 30, 35 plus years. But the best description of where we've got to today is Andy Haldane, the former chief economist of the Bank of England, who also was one of the lead architects of the Levelling Up White Paper, who described the UK economy as a hub with no spokes. And I think that's exactly what's happened. And so we have these political narratives around so-called metropolitan elites, but these issues are only relevant for a very small number of cities. Obviously, London would be one, maybe in Edinburgh, maybe at Bristol, but that's certainly not a description of Birmingham. And it's in no way a description of Bradford or Liverpool or Sheffield. You'd be lucky to find elite anything in those places. That's the nature of the problem. But what we do have is a problem of, if you like, core versus periphery. If you want to call it metropolitan elites, I don't like it, but is in terms of governance. And governance is both government, as in the Houses of Parliament plus Whitehall, but all of the affiliated and associated leading thought shaping institutions, think tanks, etc., etc. And those institutions, primarily overwhelmingly based in and around London, have simply ignored the questions of interregional inequalities until very recently. When you go beyond maybe an hour and a half, couple of hours out of London, then the economy starts to change dramatically, and so do all the social indicators. But that's been basically ignored until very, very recently. So there is a problem of perceptions and awareness here. So just to give you a few quick facts to give you a sense of what we're talking about, half the UK population today lives in areas whose prosperity in economics terms, productivity, is no better than the poorest parts of the former East Germany. That's poorer than the US states of Mississippi and Alabama and West Virginia, and poorer than many, many parts of Central and Eastern Europe. if you look at OECD multidimensional quality of life indicators, most of the UK is in the bottom half. Basically, half the UK is in the bottom half of the OECD, with an average scoring of something like the US state of Alabama. Now, these are parts of the UK of the US that we would tend to look at with despair. Well, these are descriptions of half the country of the UK. Quality and accessibility of healthcare in anywhere outside of those core regions of the UK is about the same as Eastern Europe. It always amazes me. There's so much political discussions about healthcare. The awareness of the inequalities in healthcare seems to be very low in the UK. There are huge inequalities in healthcare accessibility. Civic engagement, we tend to think of ourselves as having a strong kind of cultural, civic engagement ethos. Actually, we're pretty much in the bottom 3/4 of the OECD on almost everything. And in particular, the poorer parts of the UK are all in that lower third quartile, 3rd out of 4 blocks. And this is also including, don't forget, countries like Mexico, Turkey, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and the like, Hungary. So, it's a pretty low levels to be in. We're below everywhere else in Western Europe, basically, pretty much. You see these huge inequalities in terms of allocations of funding for things like heritage issues, R&D funding, distributions, and currently our local governance autonomy in the UK is similar to places like Albania, Moldova, Slovakia. It depends on the measure you use, but that's the kind of country we live in. And in terms of inequalities, it's quite useful to look over time. So for Andreas's interest also, I'm just going to compare the UK with Germany. So the downward sloping dotted lines are Germany. These are measures of interregional inequality. They're using different what we call systems of national accounts. So these are the OECD data classification systems. But what we see is over time, since reunification of Germany took place in 1990, so over the last 3 decades, inequality in Germany, interregional inequality, has fallen. Now, of course, at the time of reunification, West Germany in effect economically absorbed East Germany. Of course, the inequalities in Germany were massive in comparison to the UK, even the UK shocks of industrialization of the 70s and 80s. But look what's happened consistently. They've pretty much fallen, and you end up with an X shape because the inequalities in the UK have just steadily risen. And sometime after the millennium, between the millennium and the global financial crisis, those two pathways crossed. So Germany today is much more interregionally equal than the UK is. The UK is more interregionally unequal than Germany was at the time of reunification. Think about that. The UK today is interregionally more unequal than Germany was at the time of reunification in 1990. Moreover, a reunited Germany today has a prosperity premium. It is richer than the UK by a greater amount than West Germany was over the UK at the time of reunification in 1990. So this is one way of measuring it. And actually, I've got multiple measures here. These are all done with colleagues at the OECD. And we've published all this stuff before. It doesn't really matter how you measure these inequalities. You see the same patterns, this X shape. And UK-Germany comparisons are useful because city size distributions in Germany and the UK are fairly similar. The average size of our cities is typically, the big cities, 1.5, 2 million is quite normal. Lots of cities around 1 million. The biggest cities in the country are around the 2 million mark. The only outliers, of course, are Berlin and London. London is 3-4 times the size of Berlin. Of course, Berlin's a strange city because it's a product itself of the reunification, but it's a pretty successful place today. National population densities are fairly similar. That means thinking about issues around infrastructure, land use. They're not that different, really. The big difference is how they handle these inequalities. So Germany spends about 70 billion a year dealing with these issues. That includes all forms of different types of fiscal transfers. But in terms of economic development issues, Germany would be spending annually 5 times what the UK spends. That's every year. And the recent announcements which have been made around levelling up and so on, none of those numbers have changed. In fact, my suspicion is that they've actually fallen slightly in the UK, but I'm not going to go there. That's a technical argument. In terms of our cities, as I say, many people you hear in the press talk about cities versus towns, left behind towns. The cities get all the goodies. That's just simply not true. The inequalities between UK cities are pretty much in the very highest group of the OECDs. You can see them here. So this is one measure. This is another measure. This is another measure, which is rising. There's different kinds of measures. And again, we've published all this stuff. But the idea that there's a kind of a cities versus everyone else type of story in the UK, that's not true. Where does that come from? I'm just going to jump back very quickly because it does come from a particular place. If I can just find the reference. Sorry, I don't think I've actually included the reference. Well, I can tell you it's the 21st of October 2017. It was an article in The Economist, and it was called Left Behind Places. And what the article was doing was just discussing the reality of the United States today. In the US, the idea that there is an urban-rural divide, or the big cities take all the goodies and the small towns are left behind, that is basically true. In the US case, it's true. It's also true in Canada. It's true in Australia. And on a much smaller scale, it's true in New Zealand and the Republic of Ireland. Now, firstly, the inequalities in those countries are not as big as the UK. That's the starting point to remember that. They are big, particularly in the United States, but they are smaller than the UK on average. And also, of course, over very, very large distances. Secondly, also, the common feature is all of those countries are English language speaking. So what does it mean is our journalists and politicians can read what those countries are talking about, what their experiences are. This is a big problem in the UK because we are so poor at other languages that we actually haven't a clue in terms of what's going on in the other countries, which are actually much more relevant comparators to us on many levels. So what we tend to do is we tend to pick up narratives from other countries and just copy paste them into the UK. So there's left behind cities, left behind towns rather, urban rural divide, metropolitan elites. This is all copy pasted from primarily the US. And it's basically not true. In fact, the UK is less like those characteristics than almost any industrialized country. That's the extent to which these discussions are not true. But they become political narratives and they shift across parties. These are narratives you see across different parts of the House of Commons and also in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And it's really difficult to shift narratives once they get embedded. They're basically not correct, but it's very hard to shift those narratives. You know, people like myself speak publicly about these things all the time, and you can see this in my analytical work, but obviously the proportion of society who read the kind of things that I write is going to be almost infinitesimally small. A second thing, so the first thing is we don't have an urban-rural divide. We don't have a metropolitan elite in terms of economics. We have a core periphery problem. That's something very, very different. The second feature is that there is no natural trade-off between efficiency and equity. For many decades, the assumption in places like the Treasury would be, well, there's just a natural efficiency-equity trade-off. You know, if you try to help all places, the whole country is going to be weaker. It's better to kind of, you know, concentrate in the best places, the kind of London story, because that's going to benefit everybody. That was the kind of mainstream thinking going back to the 1980s. And the assumption was, particularly, if you remember in the 1970s, those of you who are my age and older will remember that London was not an effective or prosperous city, particularly in the 1970s. It had been declining in population for over 40 years. Many parts of London, particularly in the east and the south, were pretty, not particularly pleasant places to live or to work. So a lot of the thinking in the UK is very much about rebuilding the London economy, getting it to perform as a global city, internationally punching its weight or above its weight, and that will act as a motor, a driver, a catalyst for the rest of the country. And that was pretty much a universally held view. As long as you've got all the regulatory systems, competition policy in place, then all of these things will kind of come out in the wash. The problem is that never happened. What happened was London's prosperity increased at a dramatic rate from the late 1980s, early 1990s onwards. And the broad hinterland that I described was basically pulled along on the coattails of London. That's basically what happened. The rest of the country, that didn't happen. In a sense, there was just no transmission mechanism whatsoever. And this is why you've had this big split, this decoupling. So in terms of the equity efficiency argument, this is cross-country data from all the OECD countries. And what you see is basically, this is in the period before the global financial crisis. This line is almost exactly dead flat. There's just no relationship. The more inequality you have, the higher the dots into the sky. On the horizontal axis is growth. If higher inequality was also higher spatial inequality, it's higher spatial inequality, geographical, regional inequality. If that is somehow associated with higher growth, then what you would see is a strongly sloping upward sloping line. Actually, that line is almost exactly dead flat. And interestingly, all those dots high up in the sky, they are all the UK regions over different times. So we're more unequal, but we have absolutely no growth advantage over anybody whatsoever. You can see here, these are different specifications of the argument, but anyway, this is all published material. A couple of points I'll just raise from this slide. There's a couple of arguments in here I won't really deal with. If there's any questions, I may come back to this in the questions, but one of the issues you often hear is, well, yes, but the cost of living is lower. So if you're South Yorkshire, where I work, cost of living is low, so you can buy a bigger house relative to if you're living in St. Albans, for example, working in London. Well, the problem with the argument is the cost of living in those places is very low for very good reasons, because people don't want to live there. People don't want to buy there. People don't want to invest there. Now, that doesn't mean all people don't want to invest. Of course, it means relative to a Guildford or St. Albans, it's a much more risky proposition to live and work and invest there. And the reason that the prices are low is because demand is low. Demand is low for precisely those reasons I've just said. So the idea is kind of better because prices are low, kind of discussion you'd get in, I don't know, escape to the country type programs. This assumes that everything else is equal. If your probability of employment, your probability of social mobility, of entrepreneurship, of innovation possibilities, of career aspirations, all of that stuff, if those things are all equal, then of course, lower housing costs, that's great. The problem is lower housing costs indicate that these things are not equal. That's the whole problem. So the idea that, you have higher well-being, subjective well-being, because the cost of living is lower is basically simply untrue. But this is the kind of narrative that you get in the press, and you'll recognize it, I think. I'm going to jump on. This is just to talk briefly about Brexit. Now, of course, people have strong, political and ideological views on these things, or many people do. And obviously, people have different views, and we've had political processes and voting, and we are where we are now. That's very true. But in terms of the levelling up issue, this problem is not going to go away. What you see here is on the horizontal axis is the proportion of people who voted leave locally, so pro-Brexit. And on the vertical axis is the proportion of the local economy which is directly dependent on demand from European consumption and investment markets. What you see is the places that voted leave are more dependent on European markets than the parts of the country that voted remain. So the bottom left-hand dot, the real outlier, is actually London. London had the highest pro-Remain vote, but is least affected by Brexit. The reason is the London economy, per capita per person, has stronger links with the rest of Europe than anywhere else in the UK. The problem is they have stronger links with everywhere else in the world, and the relative size of the links of everywhere else in the world relative to Europe is actually higher in the London economy than in anywhere else. Whereas the dots which are in the upper right-hand part of this image, these are places like Hull, Middlesbrough, these kind of northeastern, eastern towns and cities, very, very high dependency on European markets. If you're a trader in Hull, what are you doing? Well, you're primarily sticking on stuff on boats that are going to Denmark and Sweden and the Netherlands. You're not routinely talking to Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia or parts of Belize or Ecuador. This is not your daily business. Whereas with financial brokers in London, this is exactly their daily business. So actually, the London markets are less affected, and the other parts of the country which are the least affected in terms of Brexit adversely are parts of Scotland. They are affected. Everybody's affected adversely in economic terms. Whatever the political, cultural issues, that's a different set of issues. But in terms of pure economics, But the point is that Brexit itself goes directly against the levelling up argument, which is ironic, of course, because the levelling up agenda has come out of the Brexit process. It was forged by the discontent associated with people's living standards and well-being that actually gave rise to the Brexit process in the first place. But in terms of pure economics, the trade relationships are diametrically opposed. So levelling up is actually harder precisely because of Brexit, because it will most adversely affect the weaker parts. And the language that I use to describe this is what we call geography of discontent. This is a phrase which is now used by the OECD, the European Commission. It's used by the Brookings Institution in Washington. And I actually coined the phrase at a discussion in the Netherlands. It was the week after the Brexit vote, and lots of students and people are asking me, how did that vote happen? I said it was a geography of discontent. Because basically, people in weaker and poorer places are just fed up. And in effect, Paul Collier, the famous Oxford development economist, he describes it as, well, it's a mutiny. Mutinies never have a plan. But people don't want the status quo and they want to try and change it. But you take a risk that you may make things worse. But that's the nature of all mutinies. And in a sense, this former chief executive of one of the largest cities in the UK said, well, in a sense, the Brexit vote was the right answer, but to the wrong question. It was the right answer about the need for levelling up. It's just the wrong question in the sense that Brexit will make the levelling up issue much more difficult. And there's a very large number of papers that demonstrate this using all sorts of data, including the government's own analysis. So this is a difficult problem because, of course, these are cultural, emotional, psychological issues. And strangely, this geography of discontent where people vote against the status quo to try and overturn the institutional system, in some sense, the kind of perceived status quo, the perceived wisdom. You've also seen the same things in, let's say, the United States. You know, only one city over 1 million people voted for President Trump. That was Dallas-Fort Worth. It depends on how you define the boundaries of Fort Worth County. But pretty much every other city over 1 million people voted Democrat. Why? Because that's where all the prosperity is. It is a city versus everyone else story in the United States. It's not in the UK, but it is in the US. In the case of Austria, the vote in 2016 between Hofer and van der Bellen for the presidency, the chancellorship, all the cities voted, if you like, progressive. All of the towns and the rural areas voted conservative. And the proportion of votes pro-progressive versus conservative almost entirely depends on the size of the city. And you saw the same things in the Renzi referendum in the same year in Italy. The referendum was obviously overturned in general, but the geography of those votes, again, is almost entirely related to the prosperity of the city. So this point about people voting is the notion that left behind places, people vote using the ballot box. It's a mutiny via the political process. And there are good reasons for it, because people are just fed up with the situation that they face, and they feel that they don't have a voice, that their claims and their arguments have been ignored for so long that people try something drastic. The difficulty, of course, is that you may make things worse. And certainly in the levelling up issue, the Brexit agenda has made the challenge much greater. There's no question. I'm going to jump on here because these are slightly technical arguments about COVID. I'll come back to that if people are interested. So the last couple of comments I'll make is really in the last 12 months, 2 years, there's been a lot of discussions here about place-based development or place-based policies. And even quite recently, I think it was on Radio 4, I heard people talk about place-based or people-based. The arguments here are that kind of place-based effects of what happened locally, and we need to do something to kind of improve those through more devolved government, for example, or whatever. And then there's so-called people-based policies, which is around things like skills, education. I kind of don't buy that way of thinking about the world. It's very popular. You see it in the press and also in a lot of academic papers, but I don't think that's the case. I think the difficult regional places, whether you're talking about Akron, Ohio, or you're talking about a Sheffield, is that the people-place interactions are detrimental. They're all complicated and they adversely affect each other in many ways. The idea that it's a people effect versus place-based effect, I don't think any of this is meaningful. But I do think the case of place-based institutional reform, much more devolution, is extremely important And the evidence for this is that countries which are much more devolved in terms of decision making, much more less centralized, they tend to grow more evenly. So if you take a Germany, for example, or you take an Australia, for example, countries which are much more devolved, Canada, Belgium, they tend to grow more evenly. More parts of the country grow in a similar manner. What you don't get are these huge inequalities that we get. So centralization versus decentralization, or rather devolution, more devolved countries tend to grow more evenly. That is basically true. It doesn't mean every devolved country grows evenly or every unitary centralized country grows unevenly. It doesn't mean that. But across the industrialized world, this pattern is very clear and it's very evident. And there's no overall effect on growth. There's no efficiency equity trade-off when you talk about geography or regions, as I mentioned, although people thought that for probably more than 30 years or so. And there is really a need to rethink then about how we govern ourselves, because we've ended up with a governance system which is almost uniquely ill-equipped to address the problems we're trying to address. And how do we get out of it? Because monopolies never self-reform. So Westminster and Whitehall are not going to change themselves unless there's some sort of external influences, arguments, narratives, politics, whatever it might be, to encourage or force a change in the system. But we've ended up in a situation where we've kind of trapped ourselves. And these traps relate to decision making, they relate to the fiscal structure of the country, central, subcentral, they relate to the accountability processes in the country. There's, lots of different elements on which these things all kind of affect each other. My final point is, if you are going to devolve, and I think we do have to devolve, but devolution is itself very complicated. You have to get it right first time. And one of the problems I'm worried about in the UK is the devolution that we're moving to is very, very small scale. We're moving to devolved areas which are appropriate for countries, a fifth of the size of us. Devolution, real power in devolution across the industrialized societies is typically to areas between 3 and 5 million people, because you have enough buy-in to generate a proper plan, a proper strategy, and if it's well worked out, you've got the chance of having the scale effects to leverage. When you're devolving to, let's say in the UK, counties, a lot of the discussions are at the moment, my personal view, and I'm quite public about this, is that's just far too small to have any real meaning about anything. So, and the other element is also devolution requires rethinking the fiscal underpinnings, the stabilizer system. You don't just devolve by saying, okay, you can keep all your business rates. That's not going to solve these problems. My guess is that will actually exacerbate these problems. And finally, the kind of deal-making structure, the way we've, the Treasury negotiating with each city region about an individual devolution deal, this was a good start. It was a way of starting to change things under the guidance, particularly of Lord Jim O'Neill, who just fantastic leadership and thinking. But it was a good way to get things off the ground, but it can't be a long-run kind of template of how we do things. So I think I'll stop there. I'll stop sharing my screen, and then that's about, what have I said, 50 minutes. I think that's what you said was 45, 50 minutes. You said was about the sweet spot, Andrea. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Philip. So much food for thought. I thought I sort of depressed everybody at the beginning about levelling up 40 years ago. I thought you were going to give a really positive account of how it's all going to change. So there's plenty of room for questions. But before we do, maybe everybody online wants to unmute as well and give you a big round of applause. And I'm sure we do that in the room as well. Right, we now come to the Q&A session. I'm going to walk around with a microphone here, and you can be able to talk directly into the microphone. Then we can ask the question. Who's first in the room? Lady first.
Hi, Philip. My name's Sarah Forstrom, CEO and co-founder of Good Economy. We're here with a bunch of our staff and team. It's very much a topical agenda. I was curious about your point about devolution and fiscal decentralization. In a way, we're one of the countries with one of the most sophisticated, or would think we've got one of the most sophisticated financial sectors in the world, yet we've failed to enable fiscal decentralization and empower our places to have the financial means to sort of lead their own development. So I suppose it's, how do we bring our financial sector into this? That's partly what we're looking at. We're one of the wealthiest countries, and is there financial innovation at play? Can the financial sector directly get involved in municipal bond issuance and that kind of agenda? I'm curious about that.
Philip, you heard that okay, yeah?
Yes, I did, yes. Do you want me to answer now, or do you want me to take some more questions?
No, carry on and answer the question, please.
So, I mean, this is a very good question. I mean, the irony, if you think we have one of the most, obviously we do have one in terms of the financial markets in London, the way that they operate, and also in Edinburgh on a much smaller scale. We have one of the most sophisticated, the most liquid and the deepest markets in the world on our doorstep. In some cases, they are the deepest, and yet it's very hard to get venture capital more than about an hour outside of London. It's extremely difficult. There are structural issues, and those structural issues are also related to how the governance system works. And I mean, we have heard recently there's proposals for kind of reform in terms of how pension funds and insurance companies could invest and so on. They're probably, there'll be positive issues, but the more fundamental issue is that our banking system has become ultra centralized, also over exactly the time period I'm talking about. And the more centralized becomes the banking system, the more you also get these geographical inequalities in terms of credit availability. And there's a lot of data on this, both from the UK, United States, other countries. So one of the things that's happened is we've gone to a much more centralized banking systems in general, in terms of retail banks, commercial banks, and so on. So it's just harder for people in weaker places to get credit. Or if they do get credit, it's at higher discount rates, higher interest rates, and so on. So part of the devolution agenda has to be also about trying to find ways to devolve the private aspects of the financial system. And there are things taking place at the moment. You may be aware there's something called Northern Gritstone, which has been set up by the Universities of Manchester, Leeds and Sheffield together to raise capital to fund university spin-outs. There's an agenda called Bank North, which has just been started, which is building what they call pods, which are kind of internet-based facilities, but in different cities in the north, focusing on almost entirely on SMEs and startups. There are these various things taking place, but still relative to the landscape that we have, these things are all very small. So there needs to be a much bigger restructuring about how these work. But you also see it in terms of the governance issues. I mean, local government's ability to borrow in the UK is infinitesimally small. Even the city regions, their ability to go to the markets directly is effectively non-existent. Public borrowing in sub-central government in the UK works primarily, overwhelmingly, by what's called the Public Works Loan Board, which is part of the debt management operations within the Treasury. So effectively, if you want to borrow, what you do is effectively you ring somebody up in the Treasury who answers the phone and said, well, okay, they'll go to the markets and get effectively a loan for you, an overdraft facility. I mean, it's no more sophisticated than the student overdraft facility. And that's how it works, which is very strange, given that for 40 years, everything about in the economy has been about competition. In other words, proliferation of actors engaging in competition issues, due diligence, expertise, et cetera, and you can do all of these things, except when it comes to public finance. You go the absolute opposite. You reduce the dimensionality of all those network and knowledge-related effects down to a value of one, of unity. And actually, what you need is a great deal of financial sophistication to be operating at sub-central governance systems. So if you look at the German lender, for example, look at US states, Australian states, US cities, they're all very active players in the financial markets, largely independent of the central government authorities. And what that gives them is tremendous financial literacy. They have teams with real expertise, and that's extremely important because the private sector then trusts those places. That reduces discount rates, it reduces yield interest rate values, and investors are more interested to go into partnership with sub-central government because they know that they're approaching these things with the same level or similar levels of sophistication as the private investors in themselves. In the UK, that's simply untrue. And so this is a very broad set of issues that we need a lot more thinking about. And so my notion of devolution is that we have to go way beyond what we're talking about at the moment, and it includes these kinds of issues.
Yeah, that's great. Did that answer your question? And don't get me going on the banking system in the UK. I spent decades in the banking system in the UK, and I think the way it actually grew up as a separate entity to industry, I think is still part of the problems that the UK faces. Whereas actually in the rest of the world, Germany, for example, industry and banking are intrinsically linked.
That's exactly correct. And I've written papers on this stuff with people. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, the lady wants to follow up with you, Philip. So watch out.
Good evening.
Hello.
Hi, my name's Ian. The question I'm going to ask, it's something I thought of myself. I've never heard any politician mention it. But I'm wondering whether part of the problem could be the hierarchical university system we have in the UK. Because in the UK, brightest and the best go to Oxford and Cambridge. And we've also got Imperial in London, you've got UCL in London. So there's this tendency for the brightest and the best from Liverpool and Sheffield to be sucked away into the south at the time when they're forming relationships and this type of thing, and they kind of get sucked up into this system. Whereas in other countries, I think the brightest and the best tend to go to the local universities. So if the brightest and the best from Sheffield and Liverpool went to university in Sheffield and Liverpool, might they actually be more inclined to stay there and put things back into the local economy?
Shall I answer that now, Andres, or do you want to take the question?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I put my hand up. I'm someone who went from the Liverpool area to Cambridge, but I have gone to many other countries since and many other locations. And actually, I haven't said this to Andres, but I'm actually moving to Manchester in July. I'm moving to the University of Manchester, to the Productivity Institute. So I'm going back to the northwest of England after 39 years by way of 6 different countries and 2 long spells living in the south of England. The thing is that actually that's not what happens. What you've described is actually, if you look at the data, is not what happens. In the UK, around 85% of university graduates enter into employment in the same home region that they were domiciled in before they went to university. There are flows of students to London, and this is a big political topic, the brain drain. It was on television last night, for example, on Panorama. The problem with it is it's not actually true. And this is another of my discussions where trying to confront narratives with data is a problem, because the data doesn't say that. What the data says is the vast majority of university graduates go to university either in their home region, so not in their own city necessarily. So someone from Manchester may not study in Manchester. They may well do, but they're likely to go to university in Lancaster or Liverpool or something like that, or in a neighbouring region. So they're just as likely to go to Leeds, Sheffield, Hull, etc. Whereas students from the southeast will tend to go to universities in London, or the east, or the southwest will move to the southeast, and so on. Most graduates stay within their own region or in neighbouring regions for university, and then go back to their home region for employment. And so, around 85% is the typical share working in their own home region, of which the 15% balance are primarily people moving from other regions in the UK, most of which are very close to that region. So actually, we still have a very localized university population in the UK. Students from Liverpool tend not to study at Liverpool. Well, they do, but not in the way they would in Italy or in Germany, for example. But there isn't a large brain drain. The university graduates moving into London is about 50,000 a year. That's across the whole of the UK university system, which is about 10% of the number of graduates emerging each year. It's of that order. That's less than 1% of the London labour market. It's a tiny fraction of the London labour market moving into London. The problem is that then what you get is in the civil service and in business and industry, you get people in a dinner party who are from Sunderland, Glasgow, Weymouth, Norwich, Cambridge, Manchester, Leeds, all together at a dinner party, all doing pretty well in business and in government. Look at us, we're clever kids, we all went to university, we all ended up in London, we're doing very well. And that's how the narrative becomes formed. And once you start that narrative, because those same groups of people are the thought leaders, they shape how politicians and think tanks articulate these things, that becomes very difficult to budge. But actually 20 years of evidence shows us none of this has really happened. So it's, the extent to which it does happen, it's a small issue. The large human capital premium of the London economy is primarily due to international migration. London has had, pre-Brexit, the highest human capital premium inflows of any city in the industrialized world. So, Andreas is an example. You go to the city of London and what do you see? It's filled with Spanish and Germans, Americans, Japanese, Chinese, Australians, many of whom are very talented, highly educated, and have come to work in the capital markets, the business innovation agendas, et cetera, in the London economy. So the OECD data from 2011 says that human capital premium in London is the highest in the industrialized world. The interregional flows of people in the UK are, for most regions, only of the order of 0.5% per annum in total people moving between regions. London's 1 or 2%, that's all, of which only less than 1% of the London labour market actual flows are graduates. So they're actually very small numbers, but it's quite hard to kind of articulate those in the face of the narratives which are out there.
Okay, well, that's a good question. Can I just ask one question in the chat room? I'll come back to you in just 1 second. Because Anna has got actually the reverse question, which is the current drift from the large towns and London in particular likely to have a positive influence in terms of levelling up?
Is this a COVID type work from home question? Is that what you're meaning?
Well, Anna is not. Anna, would you like to unmute yourself and clarify your question? I think Anna isn't. So I think we just take it as a general. I think the idea being that maybe the house prices, everything else, large cities are becoming more and more expensive. Maybe some of the industries are drifting away from metropoles like London.
Okay, so, well, the answer is in two parts. Firstly, there isn't a drift away from the big cities. There's no general drift away from Bristol, Edinburgh, London. There are drifts away from places like Bradford or Sheffield, but they are long-term drifts due to the low prosperity. Indeed, cities like Birmingham, Manchester were drifting for 60 years, and it was only since the opening up, particularly of the European single market migration, that those cities started to recover in terms of population growth. Subsequently, places like Manchester have kind of pushed on. But there isn't a general drift away from cities. That's not the case. What there has been, though, of course, recently in terms of COVID, is that there's this restructuring around people working from home, and the notion that people who can work online often hire people with higher educational kind of qualifications, particularly in service-related industries, are able to work much more from home, so therefore they can relocate away from the cities. There is a small effect of that, but the effect is quite a complicated one. So the first thing is that what we tend to think of is that people will move away from cities because they'll be able to work from home more of the time, and therefore have a better quality of life, maybe in smaller villages, rural environments, and so on. The kind of countryside shift. The problem with that argument is who's going to build the houses and where for that to take place, because our land use planning system doesn't allow it. So if there is a shift, it drives up prices. And you see this particularly in the West Country, huge price increases of people wanting to do this. There aren't really price increases in South Yorkshire rural regions of people shifting out, because it's not as if there was prosperous core cities in Sheffield that people are moving out of. There were insufficient jobs in Sheffield in the first place. So you don't have that buoyancy effect that would also act as a driver of people to move out. So it's not a general effect. There are some effects of it. But my guess, and I've got a very long analytical paper on this, is actually the largest effect is in the opposite direction. That the larger and more prosperous cities will actually benefit precisely from this effect. So let me give you an example to explain why. So somewhere like Sheffield, where I work, is a largish city. It's a large-ish city, around 700,000, the core city, but with a very weak economy, as you know. Higher income groups, particularly white-collar workers, tend to live in smaller villages in the outlying areas on the edge of the Peak District, places like that, and they commute into Sheffield. With the work from home, the Zoom kind of revolution, many of those people, anecdotally, are switching to jobs in Manchester or even in London, because they can pick up a job in London that they don't have to commute 5 days a week, which was prohibitive in terms of costs and also time, impossible, 2.5 hours each way, you know, £150 each way type commuting costs. If you only have to go to London now once or twice a week because you can work from home, then actually it's more efficient to take a job in London and do exactly that, or closer, Manchester, and do the same thing. And the real risk of the work from home revolution is that the bigger cities, which are more prosperous, not the big poor cities, but the big and prosperous cities, actually capture even larger hinterland markets, which make them more efficient. And places like Sheffield fall under what we call the shadow effect. That's actually an economics term, that you end up in the shadow of these bigger cities, which starts to undermine your own local economy. And that's actually the effect I am most concerned about. It's not that it will enhance the positive parts of the country. My view is that that is true, but as long as you're within a broad hinterland of a prosperous city. So it's a kind of there's two stages to this answer, really.
Okay, thank you very much. You had a question?
Hi, Philip.
Hello.
My name is Mark Hepworth. We bumped into each other.
I know Mark Hepworth, formerly of Kurds, right?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Lovely to see you. Lovely to hear you, Mark.
Thank you. I'm also a good economy like Sarah, who asked a question earlier about the financial sector. And a lot of work we're doing is on place-based impact investing.
Yeah.
Which I'm feeling, you know, having spent 35 years like you have trying to level up the country, being very disappointed in everything, is that I kind of am reasonably hopeful about the possibility that somehow we can get the city and the institutional investment world, you know, to actually go to Manchester, go to Liverpool and start working out solutions. So we have this program of work called Place-Based Impact in Innovation Labs, where we're actually going to be working on the ground with all these different places. I'd like to share that with you. So if I could get your email and so on, I'd love to do that with you. But that's the good economy work. But listening to this, we have probably as far as I remember, the most heightened level of economic and political uncertainty this country may be facing. You know, and I'm thinking about where does globalization go next? You know, who really believes in the levelling up agenda? Where will that go? Net zero, inequality, cost of living, name it. I'm really curious about where you think we could be off to. Because I think the really big question which occurs to me, having listened to you, is really what happens next. So if you could share your thoughts with me on that, that'd be good. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. For the benefit of the wider audience, I should say, sorry, I don't mean to embarrass you, Mark. When I was a PhD student, I was reading papers by Mark, already kind of fueling my interest in this broad field when he was, I think you were at Kurds at Newcastle at the time, probably. I think that's where I first came across your work, and I know that obviously we've met subsequently. So one of the issues that we don't realize is that if we think about the UK economy, the way our press operates is that we flip between extremes. And this would go across the political divide, this flipping process. So when we describe ourselves, we're either world-leading superlative or it's a disaster. Everything is either an absolute catastrophe or it's world-leading. So I see, for example, that someone in the chat, Claire Sweetnam, has just said, well, you know, she gets kind of annoyed by the fact that we're always talking about the NHS, we're still world beating. Well, that's just not what the data says. It doesn't say we're not world beating at all. It says in parts of our health service is world beating, but many parts are levels equivalent to Central and Eastern Europe, as I was referring to. But these are narratives. Now, narratives are kind of complicated because they're also potentially dangerous. Narratives can also send us in the wrong direction quite easily. So in the UK, we tend to flip between everything is either excellent, outstanding, world-beating, or it's a disaster. The characteristics of the UK economy is that we're basically just somewhere halfway down, 2/3 of the way down the peloton. You know, to use a Tour de France expression, we're about 2/3 of the way back in the peloton on almost everything. There are a small number of things where we are world-beating, probably our pop music industry, I would think probably the Premier League, the financial markets, some aspects of our heritage industries, some aspects of our aerospace and defense contracting. But once you go beyond those, some of our biosciences, most of the characteristics of the UK economy, when you measure them, are just kind of low average on almost everything. But two of the areas where we're really high, and these are areas you do not want to be high on. One of them is pretty much the highest interregional inequalities, which means that whole sections of society simply don't participate in the prosperity which is available. And a lot of people say, oh, that doesn't matter. It's interpersonal inequality that matters. Actually, almost all the statistical evidence shows that that is not true. That's how economists think traditionally. It's about how communities fare, which is what matters. And because everything that people value in terms of where they live, what they engage with, what they articulate, how they function as communities, if that is undervalued, that starts to lead to political discontent, which can be very destabilizing. In the UK, we are the most ultra-centralized governance system in the industrialized world, and yet our trust in central government, if you look at the OECD data, the UK's level of trust in central government is ranked 34th in the industrialized world. We are below Greece, we are below Italy, we are below Portugal, we are below Mexico and Brazil. And this is published. And you can see it in the OECD data.
Okay, Philip, stop cheering us up. We've got another question right at the back.
Okay.
Good evening, David Greenwood, also of the Big Economy. I was really intrigued by your talk. You mentioned that it sounded like you would like to riff a little bit about local development tracks within the context of UK place-based policy. So if you did have a few paragraphs, that would be really appreciated, and perhaps some insights into how to sidestep these traps, if you have any ideas.
Well, I've been writing on a lot of these things over the last few years, trying to articulate different aspects of these problems. And what I think in the UK context is needed to do to try to get over some of these development traps. And for me, devolution is a critical part of that, but you have to do it properly. Having effectively these contests where local areas compete for a bit of money, which is then kind of thrown out somewhere sporadically from Whitehall, or having local enterprise partnerships drawing up plans which they submit to Whitehall to get shared prosperity funding. I've been very clear, this is not devolution. This is just a different form of central local control. I think the devolution agenda is absolutely critical. I think devolution has to be done at scale. You need very local, neighborhood level, even street level for kind of civil society engagement. But in terms of economic arguments, you need much bigger units. that has to be done, because otherwise people don't engage with the governance system. The governance system cannot of itself improve. And so I think that the kind of development trap argument is intrinsically related to the devolution issue. And I have been writing a lot about this recently, about the technical aspects of that. If anyone's interested, I'm quite happy to send papers on to see the arguments, because they are complex, but I'm quite happy to communicate what I think.
Good. Well, thank you very much for that. We've got a little bit of time left. I'm now going to go to online, because it's quite a few questions there. I mean, Philip, we're not going to get through all the questions today, because the chat room is a buzz. But if I send you some of the comments and observations, would you mind replying, and I can send them on to?
Sure.
That's fine. So one you mentioned already, Claire Sweetnam has a comment, having been involved in the 2010 Michael Marmot review on health equity, the two barriers to implementation were short-termism.
Yes.
What? And the other one, let me just scroll down, the arrogance that the NHS was still world-beating.
Yes.
So anything else to say about short-termism rather than the NHS?
Well, the point about the NHS in the southeast of England is world-beating. It's just not world-beating anywhere else. That's the problem. And there are pockets of place where it's very good, but as a general, once you get out of that core area of the economy, it's very, very weak in comparison to most international benchmarks. But that reflects the way we run the country as a whole on almost every dimension. And the centralization we have is also built on fragmentation. That central government operates by, or traditionally has done for 40 years, by ensuring that local government is weak. So local government, in effect, they have decentralized responsibilities. They do what they're told by the centre, and they simply carry those activities out.
Yep.
And then the centre decides whether they're carrying them out in a sufficient manner or not. But local government has almost no autonomy to think, hang on a second, in this part of the country, given the challenges, we should be doing things differently in a particular way and galvanizing a lot of local engagement, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we saw in COVID, these things started to happen, particularly vis-a-vis civil society, but that's not in general how we run the country. And this is what devolution has to be about. Devolution can't be about just giving bits of pots of money for localities to bid for. It has to be about a real, complete rethinking and restructuring of how the system of governance of the country works.
Okay, good. Ray, I'm not going to read out Ray's question in total, but it's basically saying what incentives can be given in the most deprived areas to attract the right kind of talent and the right kind of industries?
Well, I think the key thing is it's incentives are part of a broader suite of issues. If you have proper governance systems where you have a lot of stakeholders with a vested interest in making the place better, so you have lots of participants, then you start to develop policy testings which are much more holistic. So, for example, you think about businesses in the UK, the economic geography of the country is so diverse that the kind of industries that dominate in South Yorkshire, where I teach, where you are in Bath, for example, there's almost no industries of those forms in Bath. So that would suggest that the kind of priorities for skills training that you would have in the Bath area would be very different to those in South Yorkshire. But there's no ability for local businesses and the local governance community to alter or to adapt the skills training system to local needs. Now whereas in Germany, this is natural through the chambers of commerce. This is how the whole system works. In the UK, we simply have no parallel. So the problem is that this is actually the more general problem. You need to have governance systems that allow a lot of stakeholders to become involved, bring forward their expertise and ideas, and do it in a way which is in the kind of mutual local interest. At the moment, we have no governance infrastructure to allow any of these types of things to take place.
Yeah. Okay. Duncan is making a statement, but it's probably a question. Surely it's the transition from a society based on patronage to one heading to be based on merit that will make the difference.
Well, people have different views on these things. I mean, if you look at the functioning of the UK labour market, we're the second most decentralised labour market in the industrialised world, along with the Netherlands. We're the most competitive product markets in the industrialised world. That was while we were in the European Union. So in terms of the economy being based on privilege and merit, I mean, that's a complicated one. I'm aware people do have
Philip,
sorry.
The whole question was, surely in the transition from a society based on patronage to one heading to be based on merit,
Yeah.
privileged communities will emerge, but will they dissipate as they become insecure, as meritocracy continues to rise?
Well, what I was saying is that there's actually a lot of evidence that meritocracy hasn't been rising in the last 15, 20 years. That the rise of meritocracy peaked in the 1990s. And since then, there are many arguments that meritocratic processes have actually been stalled in many parts of the industrialized world. And in the country such as the UK, the reason is not because of the education system, but because of the operation of the housing markets. That people who were in some sense part of the meritocratic processes were doing well in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, became involved primarily in places like the London or the Edinburgh housing markets. That's where they're prosperous. The transitions of those markets generate enormous equity gains in terms of capital, and then that is recycled in terms of collateral for new business formation, investment for schooling for children and grandchildren and so on. So actually the meritocratic processes, there are many arguments that they've actually started to go into reverse in many cases. So my point is that there is one argument that says what you're saying may operate, and that was kind of how economists in the 1990s, 80s, 90s assumed would be the case. But the evidence since then is actually the opposite has happened, particularly at the upper end of the income distribution.
Okay. Well, listen, we could be going on forever here. We touched on the housing market, and I don't think we'll have time to solve that one tonight because that's a key facet of the problem. Before we could draw it to a conclusion now, it's nearly 9 o'clock. Before I tell you a little bit more what's coming up over the next month or so, perhaps we could all put our hands together online and in the room to thank Philip once again for an excellent talk.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you.
It's always great to get applause both online and offline. I think we've been missing that for a while. Good. Well, look, the things that are coming up next are not purely economics, but I think might be really interesting. For example, next week, I'm going to do a world affairs bit. And how often do any of us have the chance to actually talk to two co-authors of the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change latest report in terms of where we're heading, what the implications are, and what are the risks, and what we actually need to do to adapt to changes. It basically says, look, climate change is here, it's going to get worse, and actually we need to look at not prevention, but actually adaptation to it. So, but this is a unique opportunity. Unfortunately, it's going to be online only. It's probably on the 17th of May. It's after all the things are finished here in terms of the Bath Festival. So you have no excuse not to dial in and listen to that, because I think it's a wonderful opportunity. You know, you don't very often get the authors of the actual IPCC report giving a lecture. That's on the 17th of May. Then in June, we've got something that we touched on today. We've actually got Nicholas Lamb, a American economist, zooming in to us into the Elwyn room to talk about the 6 phases of globalization. That would be really interesting. You know, we touched on globalization, so that would be interesting. And then on the 21st of June, again, a political Russian political economist, Sergei Guriev, is going to give a talk on his book, Spin Dictators, Tyranny in the 21st Century. And it's basically charting a change of how dictators operate from fear to actually propaganda and spin. And that will have serious economic consequences around the globe. And I'm sure he will touch on the current situation in Ukraine as well, which again is going to have political and economic consequences all across the world, and particularly in Europe. So on that cheerful note, I shall leave you for another week. I hope you can dial in to the online-only talk next week on climate change. But otherwise, I shall see you back here in June. And as I always finish these lectures, and hopefully we're nearly past this pandemic, I say, next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and most importantly, stay sane. All the very best. See you next time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andreas.
Bye-bye, everyone.